you. Well, what an ambitious title, Egyptology, Egyptologists, and the Exodus. My paper really is a much longer one, as the title might infer. And now, okay, there we go. Now we're beginning to advance. And I'm simply going to outline the major parts of this because I will never get to it. But early Egyptology and Bible history is the focus of the first part. Egyptology and the Exodus, 1880s to 1960. Egyptology and the Exodus, 1960 to the present. And geography of the Exodus in recent decades. Now, going back to the early point, the Egypt Exploration Fund, now society that publishes Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, was founded in 1882 with interest in biblical studies set in Egypt. In the Memorandum of Association, the EEF stated that one of its purposes was to make surveys, explorations for the purpose of elucidating and illustrating the Old Testament narrative, and any part thereof insofar as the same is in any way connected to Egypt. And so the EEF, later to become the EES, sponsored the works of Edward Naville and Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. And you can see from the title of their early publications the role of especially the archaeology of the Exodus and in particular geography. In fact, it was a very heated debate between Sir Alan Gardner in 1924 and T. Eric Peat in 1922 that got very nasty, the two of those gentlemen attacking Naville and they're calling Naville a fundamentalist and things like that, and so things haven't changed much. But what I believe happened after that is that a great divorce occurred, and Egyptology went down its own path. I told Bill Deaver this, that in essence what Gardner and Peat did for archaeology, Bill Deaver did for biblical archaeology and Syro-Palestinian archaeology. That is to push the disciplines apart for the purpose of allowing Egyptology to become its own professional degree in its own right. Now, that's all fine and good, except that biblical studies, in my view, really needs Egyptology. I know some people in this room don't think that. I do. I had the pleasure myself of being trained with two Egyptologists, the late Ronald Williams, who was a Dematist, a Herodoticist, a grammarian of Egyptian, who could also work in Akkadian and happened to write a book on Hebrew syntax. I studied Hebrew wisdom literature with him and read Egyptian wisdom texts with him, and also with Professor Redford, who sadly is not with us. So I actually was schooled working with professors who were able to, in their own work, bring Egyptology and biblical studies together, and I'm sort of a product of that school of thought. Now, when we go back, as I said, to the early days of Egyptology, there was great interest in the geography of the Exodus, and in more recent decades, the debate has taken on new angles. The question of mythological or authentic geography has already been addressed in a sense last night by Professor Bitak, and I'm so grateful for what he said because I can build on it and join him as being one of the intellectually indefensible people in our midst. Now, I'm speeding on here, but I wanted to read one quote in particular, again, recognizing that there are those who talk of the geography of the Exodus narrative. And again, I'm trying to create a link going back to the beginnings of Egyptology to where we are now, 120-some years later. But I left this one quote from a commentary on Exodus by William Johnstone, who talks about the focus of the Bible is purely theological and therefore it is futile to attempt to locate this theological affirmation in geographic detail. In other words, the Bible's interests are purely theological, not geographical. Now, in response to that sort of approach and to sort of mythic geography, Redford himself said, "This is a curious resort, for the text does not look like mythology, at least on the definition of the latter as a timeless event set in the world of the gods. The biblical writer certainly thinks he's writing datable history." And then his own conclusion, and you heard about that from Professor Bitak last night, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it from Redford's presentation, is that he argues that the geography is largely 7th century Saite period, and this has been very influential. I would say this has influenced the works of Israel Finkelstein. This has influenced the work of John Van Seters and several others. But in any event, Van Seters in the Max Miller Festschrift wrote, "The geographic background to the Exodus story is Egypt in the time of the writer," and I agree. The question is, should the theoretical reconstructions of the dating of the Pentateuchal sources determine the date of the toponymy, or should the Egyptian data themselves provide the dating, or at least reflect a more ancient memory than the period when the text may have been written? So that, I think, is the nub of the problem. Now, Professor Bitak dealt with some of this, and I want to try to steer away from things that he did, but simply to build on them, and so simply refer back to some of the geographical terms that he already introduced last night. But I do want to take a quick gander at Tel el-Maskuta, if we back up, located in the Wadi Tumilat, and you recognize that the name Maskuta does preserve the term Sukkot, which derives from the Egyptian word Cheku. I go back to Maskuta. Again, my teacher, John Holliday, of course, worked here during the 70s and 80s, so I was fully aware of what was going on there. We do know that there was a place called Cheku, and that seems, and certainly in New Kingdom times, to have been a region, not just a specific spot. However, Anastasi Papyrus 5 refers to the Seger of Cheku, the stronghold of Cheku, that seems to suggest that during the Ramesside era, there actually was some sort of military presence there, although archaeologically, Holliday never found any of that. His predecessors working there, however, did find a number of Ramesside period materials, such as this statue of Ra-Harakti with the cartouche of Ramses II, the Maskuta naos of Ramses II, a granite naos, and a 9th century statue of Ankh-Renep Nefer, who was the military commander during the 9th century or the 3rd intermediate period. So something was going on at Sukkot, Cheku, during these periods. It could well be that these blocks were simply relocated from Tel el-Rataba as a reasonable proposal, or that there really was something there that simply hasn't been discovered yet. In 2010, this tomb was discovered quite by accident. And why it's so interesting is that it is a Ramesside period tomb, the first of its kind, found at Tel el-Maskuta, and it belongs to a military officer who was stationed there in the Ramesside era. So this is not, my knowledge of this is only through the Egyptian press and confirmation of its nature from one Egyptian antiquities inspector, but full publication has not taken place. But just to remind you that sometimes archaeology doesn't tell the whole story, and that's why work continues, because new things pop up at old sites. I want to take a look at this particular collocation of sites in Exodus 14:2, where we have references to 4 datum points. Pi Hachirot, mentioned or hinted at earlier today, Migdol, the sea, and Baal Zephon. And I'm very grateful for some of this touched on by Professor Bitok last night, but my point in bringing this verse and to focus on it is because there seems to be a very serious attempt to draw attention to a specific location, as if we have very specific datum points, not just some random sites that have, that might be out of the Narnia Chronicles. Long it has been known that the etymology of the Hebrew Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, and the Egyptian Patufi, that recognition goes all the way back to Bruges in the 19th century. Now, the location of the Egyptian marshy area known as Patufi in Egyptian text has been known, and some of that even discussed last night. One text that perpetually is overlooked by scholars, either talking positively about the location of Yam Suf or those who want to ignore it and place it in a mythic realm, is the all-important onomasticon of Amenemope that probably comes from the reign of Ramses III. In it, one section has a list of demis, cities, or toponym sites. A very interesting list that moves from south to north, with the number 314 in this list being the southmost site of Biga Island, just by Aswan. And you move north, and I'm not going to take you through the entire sequence, but as you move north by 394, you are at Memphis. 410, you're at Pi-Ramesses. 417, you're at Tanis. And 418 is Patufi. They're treated as a specific toponym with a city determinative. Very odd that you have it used with a city sign, probably indicating that it's a toponym of a specific area. But lastly, and the last place on the sequence is the fortress Charu or Sile. Now, at the end, we'll come back to that. But the point seems to be that this body of water, this marshy area, is located at the very northeastern frontier of Egypt, south of Charu, as we know in the Egyptian text, Sile, as it's known in Semitic texts. Now, Papyrus Anastasi III was introduced last night, and this is the text that Professor Bitok was citing, in which you see a parallelism between Patufi, a place where rushes grow, and the Lake of Horus. And I am in total agreement with his Bitok's view going back to 1975, Tel Adaba II, and his more recent maps here, in which you actually have these two parallel bodies of water on Egypt's eastern frontier, the southern of which, the Balach Lakes, of which he identified as the Patufi of Egyptian texts. By the way, that all begins to make sense when you realize that Silo Charu is right up here, the northmost site at Egypt. And if this indeed is Egyptian Patufi, you'll notice that it is just to the south of that. Now, Pi-Hahirot is a toponym that has evoked a lot of interest. In my view, no convincing Egyptian etymology has been accepted. And the best suggestion is that it's a Semitic term, or a possible combination of Semitic and Egyptian. Albright, as early as 1948, had suggested it was to be understood as the mouth of the canals. And this is based on the word charot being derived from the Akkadian word charu, which means to dig up, etc. In Old Babylonian, charutu means digging work and applies to irrigation ditches and canals in Kassite period texts, CAD 6176. Now, in Papyrus Anastasi III, once again, there's mention of the Lake of Horus, which is probably what we call the East Frontier Lagoon. We're told that it contains salt. No surprise. It interfaces with the Mediterranean. And Pacheru, and by the way, I'm giving you Ricardo Comines' translation because he wasn't quite sure how to render this. So he simply transliterated it. Pacheru contains natron, its ships sail and dock. What is this Pacheru? A A more recent translation by James Allen in Context of Scripture has this as the Lake of Horus has salt, the canal has natron, its ships set out and dock. That's in Context of Scripture, Volume 3. Pacher, Allen goes on to elucidate, is the name of a navigable, brackish body of water in the eastern Egyptian delta, perhaps joining an arm of the Nile to the Lake of Horus. And I want to refer to an article that sometimes is overlooked, a very good one, on these toponyms in Papyrus Anastasi 3, Henri Cazal's Revue Biblique article of 1955, very helpful here. But the East Frontier Canal, so named by the Israeli geologists who discovered it in the 1960s and 70s, found a stretch of a canal and a couple different sections in northern Sinai during their geological surveys. Here's an aerial photograph of one section that's just shown right there with the red arrows pointing. This is what actually got me to Sinai in 1994. I was curious to learn what we could possibly learn about this body of water. You've already seen this important satellite image, the corona image, but at the very bottom of it, perhaps you can see this line that makes up this canal, and thanks to the corona image, we now know that it flowed slightly differently than the Israeli geologists thought based on their more limited aerial photographs. So there's some sort of canal, man-made, and that you can be told by the dumps on either side of this 70-meter wide chasm. Now, did I get something out of order here? I think, malish. Well, just leave it with a question. Could this canal, be the Pachiru or the Pihachirot of Exodus 14:2 is the question I leave with you. In Papyrus Anastasi 3, again describing the watery northeastern frontier, there is also a lake or a body of water. It's called the Waters of Baal. And again, Professor Bitok reminded us last night of the frequency with which the god Baal-Zephon figures in the northeastern delta during the Hyksos period and beyond, even with the Ramessides and their interest in Baal-Seth. So there clearly was some sort of body of water also in this area in late Ramesside times called the Waters of Baal. The last place in this collocation of reference points is Migdol, and I just place up here the references to Migdol in the Bible, and you can see we have them in connection with the Exodus itinerary. It's mentioned in connection with Jeremiah's coming to Egypt, and also Ezekiel knows of it as the northern border of Egypt, going from Migdol to Aswan in the south. Now, since the days of Sir Alan Gardner in 1920, his very famous article in JEA Volume 6, he tried to identify the sites of the Seti reliefs at Karnak, and he was the first to propose, to my knowledge, Claydon may have a little bit earlier, but in any event, he identified Tel El-Her with Migdol of the Bible and also Migdol of the relief of Seti I. We'll come back to that. But this is the site of Tel El-Her, which for over 30 years has been dug by my neighbor in Sinai, Dominique Valbel of the Sorbonne. She was very hopeful that this was going to be the New Kingdom site of Migdol, that we know from Egyptian text. Alas, it turned out to be a Persian period site that goes down all the way to Greco-Roman times and was probably Magdala of Greco-Roman period texts. Meanwhile, you can see Tel El-Her on this map. To the north is the site of Tel Kedwa, or what Eliezer Oren called T21, and excavated there. And you can see here in the foreground the walls of Tel Kedwa, and in the distance the Tel of Tel El-Her. They're just about 1.5 kilometers apart. This is the site that Oren excavated and identified as a Migdol of the prophets in Besor some years ago. A little more work since his initial work has suggested that this site had several defensive makes and remakes. But the point is, if Orrin is correct, this seems to be the site called Migdol of the 8th and 7th century. The site apparently moved south to Tel El Her, but neither of them gave us a New Kingdom Migdol. Now, why this is significant both for biblical studies and Egyptology is from the famous relief of Seti I, we know the sequence of forts going across North Sinai, and these include, well, you can read, the third fort in the sequence is the Migdol of Seti I. We know the site of Migdol from the reliefs of Ramses III at Medinat Habu, a frontier fort. And we can now identify with certainty the beginning of this sequence thanks to the works at Tel Hebwa 1 and 2 of our colleague Muhammad Abdul Maqsood. You can see the Ramesside period fort, the statue that was discovered in 1999 with the name Charu on it. And I'm speeding along because I've been given a 5-minute notice. Did that 5 minutes take into account the 5 minutes I lost? Okay, sorry. Here's our site Tel El Borg, located just about 2.5 kilometers from the fort at Hebwa 2, where you see this Roman numeral 2. And here you can see our famous New Kingdom 18th dynasty moat built on fired brick foundations. That it is New Kingdom 18th dynasty is no doubt because of the stamp steel inscriptions we found of the Amarna period, including one of Akhenaten right there. We also have a Ramesside period fort here, the walls of which you can see how badly are denuded. Maybe 10 meters of wall is gone. We're down to our final brick, but there is the footprint of this fort. And we're going to skip. But this fort was probably decorated by Ramses II. We have Merneptah decorating part of the walls all the way down to Ramses III when the fort appears to have been destroyed when the Sea Peoples invaded during his reign. Now, I'm going to fast forward. This is all the Mosier material, and I wanted to come to an end by this reconstruction of this area that you begin to get an impression of what this area is like when we combine the archaeological and the geological. And I wanted to end with a little excavation of a site that I identified in 2002, but did not get to dig. Our French colleagues did. And a little fort was found at a site called Tel Abyad or Tel Abeda, very small, narrow walls, only about 2 meters wide, not a huge defense wall, but nevertheless another part of the East Frontier defense system in New Kingdom times. Now, can any of these be identified with Migdol? One of the things these corona images tell us is that where we tend to have black dots, we have archaeological sites. And you can see them. Now, if you notice the very southern tip of the lagoon here, right by that canal branch, that canal that goes right by, is what appears to be a site at the very southern tip of the lagoon. Eliezer Orn identified this in his survey, calling it T211, a New Kingdom site based on the pottery scattered within that circled area. He actually marked this for me. I'm indebted to him. And you can zoom in, and you can actually see there was some sort of fort there. And this would seem to be the location of Migdol of Ramses III and Ramses II. Now, what does this all mean? And here we end. Okay. So Migdol at the very southern end. Now, I want you to see the collocation here of Migdol, the canal, which would be just to the east of Migdol on this map, and the northern reaches of Patufi, and you see something of the collocation I'm talking about. Now, the point is, and I'm building here on what was said last night and what I've added to, all of these toponyms find written attestation in the Ramesside period or earlier. Some of them do exist in the Saite period. That doesn't make them Saitic in origin. The names do go back. Every one of these places I've talked about, we have them in the 13th century. So if we're dealing with some sort of collective memory, it has a kind of specificity that I think cannot be simply dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions.
I would just like to ask two questions of a phonological nature, graphemic nature, because the biblical Ramses uses two sameks in the writing. This is, I think, a transcription that is not possible before the middle of the first millennium BC. So if it were a genuine Ramessid transcription, it would use the sin. I would expect the sin, not the samek. That was only possible later. The same with the Yam Suf. The F would not normally appear in New Kingdom transliterations. So it seems to be, the spiritization seems to be a later phenomenon.
Well, the sibilants are a problem in more than one direction, as you know. The Bible consistently, for instance, the samek in Cheku, the Egyptian ch becomes samek, as you know. I realize that, but I'm just talking about the samek. But the very fact that you have, as you know, by the time you get to late period Egyptian, the ch becomes a t. So it cannot be borrowed into Hebrew in a late period. It would be Tukoth, not Sukoth. So I think you can point to some things and say linguistically, these have to appear earlier. In terms of the sameks being used in Ramesses, it's true. In the Egyptian scene, when it appears in the Amarna letters, it's written with a sheen. You well know the article in JNES many years ago by Griffiths, who tried to argue for the difference between what he called fossilized names and sort of live contemporaneous names. But it's worth noting that the name Ramesses does not pop up outside of the Pentateuch. It's only there in the Bible. Why is that? When later references are made to Tanis, like Psalm 78, Tanis is used, not Ramesses. So there's something interesting going on there. But these are linguistic issues that have been addressed by some.
Be read on monuments in Tanis and then in the mid-first millennium being transcribed.
Sorry, can
with
you use the
samek.
microphone, please?
Right. So, but Ramses could have been read by individuals on monuments visible in Tanis in the mid-first millennium, and at the time correctly transliterated into Hebrew with sameks, right? So that would be possible.
To me, I'm not ready to make that leap of faith that a Hebrew priest comes down to Tanis and reads hieroglyphs.
Not a Hebrew priest.
Late period and
No, but Egyptian
transcribes
priest.
it in a proper late. I'm not ready
Egyptian
for that.
priest.
I'm sorry?
An Egyptian priest that's talking to his Hebrew colleague.
He brings Hebrew colleagues into the temple. Bring foreigners into the temple. This is a temple. It's not a museum. Think about it. Foreigners not welcomed in temples, are they?
Well, I think there are scenarios to cope with that. It's monuments all over the place in Tanis, and somebody just needs to be asked, like Herodotus later, what can you read on the monuments? And he says, well, it's everything. It says Ramses. Nobody has to enter the temple to become acquainted with that Ramesside tradition still be pervasive in Tanis, I think, in the first millennium.
Okay, we have two
You're welcome to
opinions
hold that view.
here, and
Thank you.
I hope we'll continue this discussion. I want to move on to